Bonjour à tous, hello everyone, ici Pierre Lemonde, président du CORIM. Bienvenue à ce rendez-vous en ligne. We are pleased to have with us the administrator of the United Nations Development Program, Mr. Achim Steiner. Hello Achim, how are you?
Bonjour Pierre, très bien, bonjour à Montréal et merci pour l'invitation. C'est un grand plaisir.
Thank you very much for being with us. Your participation is truly appreciated. As you probably remember, we had the pleasure to have you with us when you were the executive director of the UN Environment Program in 2007. Time flies, eh? Well, it's nice to have you back with us. Nice to have you back with us. So the discussion today will be about incorporating the DNA of an inclusive green economy in post-COVID recovery planning. You will also talk about innovative systems and tools to better foster international collaboration and the critical shifts necessary to realize the Agenda 2030. To discuss it with you, we have the Vice President, Programs and Partnership at the International Development Research Center, Madame Dominique Charron. Bonjour Dominique, comment ça va?
Bonjour tout le monde, bonjour la communauté du CORIM, Achim et Pierre. C'était vraiment un plaisir et un honneur de faciliter la discussion aujourd'hui.
Well, thank you for having accepted to lead this discussion. And without further ado, the floor is yours, Dominique.
Thank you, Pierre, and thanks to the Montreal Council for International Relations for hosting this conversation today. Achim Steiner, it's really a delight to have you with us today. This is a critical time. Progress towards achieving the SDGs is really at serious risk of backsliding due to the pandemic. We know that the pandemic has strained the capacity of healthcare systems, pushed economies to the breaking point, and transformed daily lives of billions of people in countless ways. It's really a transformative event. And it has also highlighted the need for a global shift towards more sustainable, resilient, and inclusive development for a better future. As part of Canada's international assistance efforts, you may recall Canada's International Development Research Center, or IDRC, my organization, is focused on catalyzing solutions to development challenges. And we do this through funding research, evidence-based, evidence-backed solutions through science, led by researchers and stakeholders throughout the global South. And we are proud to work with innovative, like-minded organizations like the United Nations Development Program. But the way forward for international cooperation seems to be fraught with challenges, from financing the COVID response to accelerating action on climate change to taking decisive action on gender inequality and exclusion. Recently, as you know, IDRC was pleased to participate in the development of this new UN research roadmap for a recovery from COVID that was commissioned by the Deputy Secretary General, Dr. Amina Mohammed. And the roadmap highlights not only knowledge gaps, but the huge potential to catch up on the SDGs as we emerge and build forward from this pandemic. There are positive opportunities to take action, and we're looking forward to covering those with you now. It's really a pleasure and an honor to have the opportunity to chat with you. So let's go to the first topic that Pierre highlighted. This: how do we build in the DNA of a green and inclusive economy as we recover from and emerge perhaps from the pandemic? And here in Canada, as elsewhere in the world, the response to COVID has prompted similar discussions. How do we build back better? And we've taken this at IDRC to mean that there's a need for evidence to spur action on climate change, on refocusing infrastructure to better protect against future threats, and how do we address those the exacerbation of inequalities and backsliding of progress on gender equality. You've spoken recently about this, the DNA. of an inclusive green economy in the worldwide recovery. How do we do this?
Well, Dominique, first of all, let me thank the Montreal Council on Foreign Relations to have invited me back. And that is a very nice sign that after 2007, I have an opportunity to once again be hosted by you, and that is a great pleasure. And Dominique, just to say also, IDRC has been my companion for 30 years of my own professional work in development. And so it's a pleasure to not only be here with you today, but also, as you mentioned, IDRC remains a very strong reference point for us in the United Nations, as you alluded to just now when our Deputy Secretary General turned to you also for trying to frame a research agenda. This is by way of saying it's great to be back in Canada, even if it's virtual, and I miss the exchange because you have a tradition in academia, in public policy, in civil society, in business leadership of having something that we so often, and the Secretary General of the United Nations being the clearest voice in that, calling on people to look both within their own communities and societies on how to manage this crisis, but not to lose sight that in the midst of a pandemic, we are actually bound to succeed or fail by also looking at how others are doing. And that, I hope, will be part of the way in which we can also conceptualize discussions about green recovery and many of the things that flow from it. I think to those who might raise an eyebrow at this moment when you say, well, green recovery has to be a centerpiece of the way we look at the future, rightly are skeptical, because in the initial phase of these extraordinary stimulus packages, and let's also remind ourselves, we have suspended virtually every rule of financial and monetary policy just in the last 11 months, $12 trillion largely mobilized within the developed world and deployed also within the developed world. And much of that really a crisis stabilization finance reflex that is actually not investing in a green recovery or in green transformation. It is actually stabilizing the economy of today and, in a sense, the economy of yesterday that defines so much of our infrastructure, energy systems, urban infrastructure, and also transport systems, just to take a couple of examples. So I think there is a profound sense of disruption that is happening simultaneously across the world. I don't think there is any precedent in human history of a pandemic simultaneously taking 193 nations to the brink of one, first of all, a major health crisis, secondly, an economic crisis and freefall, and thirdly, the resulting social disruption, the pain, the death, but also the destitution that defines so much of what is happening in the midst of this pandemic. But as we invest trillions, and richer countries have more money, they have more resources to draw on, but even the poorest countries are scraping together the last dollar, the last currency that they can find to actually be able to, first of all, have their health systems not collapse. Secondly, to also stabilize and protect those who are most vulnerable. And this has been the particularly dramatic tragedy in this crisis, that it is in the lack of social protection that half of the world's population still experiences, who live without any social protection. There is no unemployment benefit, there is no social safety net. And then 80 to 90% of people in developing countries earning their living in the informal sector. So the very measure to contain the virus actually forces you into an almost existential situation where hunger becomes a very real prospect, never mind that you can't send your children to school and many of the other issues. And yet, as we stabilize this crisis, I think there is a deep sense that this didn't all just happen in these 10 months. Part of the reason why this pandemic has had such a brutal impact, has caught us in such an unprepared way, but also is affecting people in such differential ways, is that there is a deeper condition of inequality that has been persistently getting worse as the world got richer. And that's one of the contradictions. Secondly, that the vulnerability and our resilience to a pandemic, a virus, is actually compromised by the way that our development choices of the 20th century, the pathways that we still pursue in the 21st century, are eroding our capacity to live on this planet. So I think the departure point for inserting that DNA of a green recovery must begin with actually where people currently are reflecting on what has gone wrong and what do we need to do differently. If you then start getting far more practical and look at what is happening with technology, with markets, but also with the international efforts to address climate change, to stop the destruction of biodiversity, the extinction of species, you begin to have a conversation where the public is expecting of our leaders in politics, in the economy, to find a way of investing forward, not to go back to where we were, but to investing forward. And this is where UNDP, with many others right now, is engaged in an intense process of exploring what are the levers we can pull. Many countries don't have a lot of extra money to invest, so they have to mobilize what they have. But decisions we take today will fundamentally shape our ability not only to get out of this crisis, but to get out of it better. And here, there are very clear opportunities. And it starts with the poorest in the world. There are still 600 to 700 million people on the African continent who have no access to electricity today. Helping to provide a stimulus to economic development and recovery needs to look at them as both vulnerable, but also with an extraordinary opportunity to help the African continent invest in a green energy, first of all, access to energy pathway, and secondly, transformation towards a cleaner energy future. Africa will soon have, by 2050, probably 2 billion people. If the model of electricity generation on the continent of Africa replicates that of the rest of the world from the last century, the Paris Agreement is irrelevant. But also markets are actually moving that direction. Technology is enabling us to move forward. The competitiveness of renewable energy technology is today uncontested and is actually amongst the most competitive forms of investment. If you look at the financial sector, the risk that is now associated with a heavy carbon footprint that will possibly leave you being, in a sense, a stranded asset is shifting financial markets, companies who need to make investment decisions. So all of this, I think, is a reason to believe in not only the moment in time where we need to act, but the possibilities of acting. And just this morning, we released a report that, together with the University of Denver, again highlighted that this is a moment of choice. Of choices about how to deal with the crisis, but also choices that lead us into tomorrow. And the scenarios are very different. If we go back to where we were before, we may, and the crisis persists, end up with more than 1 billion people in extreme poverty by 2030. If we make deliberate choices to go in the opposite direction and address inequality, exclusion, and address also the sustainability Achilles heels, we may actually be in a better place than we were even in 2019 when we were looking at the 2030 Sustainable Development Goals. And that is why thinking about what kind of DNA do we insert into recovery and into the economic futures that we are essentially summarizing under the term development choices is so central. And it's not something for tomorrow, it's something for today.
Thanks, Achim. And you're provoking an additional sort of thought here for me as we think about this opportunity, yet we also are understanding that there aren't necessarily obvious solutions to how we do this in a context where we're also continuing to fight a live fire in the sense of dealing with the pandemic. How do you see the role of research and evidence in really helping inform and infuse that DNA into the recovery?
Well, it is fundamental. Not everything we decide, we always decide because of empirical evidence. There are normative issues. There is the question of intergenerational solidarity or looking after my neighbor. You know, I have spent the last 11 months locked up here in New York. And what I've seen is, in a sense, systems collapse and at the same time, social systems rise to the challenge. It's that deeper human nature that defines our intuition, but then we need also very clear analysis. And that's why research is so central, to understand why so many people stepped out onto the streets, whether it is in Hong Kong, in Beirut, in Paris, in Santiago de Chile, here in New York, over the last couple of years, is in part because we did not see an erosion of a confidence in the future by the middle class. We didn't recognize how income inequality was tearing at the very fabric of society. So economists, social scientists, who were beginning to document this but were not seen and understood, let us go far too long in that direction. The same applies to atmospheric scientists. The ability to understand that carbon emissions lead to global warming, that they accumulate in the atmosphere, is a simple example of research. And then it took us 30 years to consolidate that research to a point where politics and the economy could no longer walk away from this evidence. So I consider research and evidence and empirical analysis critical, just like the development of new technologies is fundamental. What we have seen just in the last 10, 12 months is an extraordinary fast forward of digital technologies. We knew they were out there. We knew that they would become more ubiquitous. None of us would have foreseen that by December 2020, we would have, probably virtually every country in the world having experienced both the centrality of digital platforms to continue and maintain government continuity, the ability, like in a country like Pakistan, to stand up a social cash transfer program for more than 14 million households, reaching 75 million people in a matter of weeks. We are working in Honduras right now, assisting the government there in putting into implementation a cash transfer program that identifies the most vulnerable, uses digital technology, provides transparency, and reaches 500,000 people. These are existential measures that are being taken. And so, in a nutshell, I consider it not only central from an evidence point of view, but also for an informed public. We do not live in an age where things are too complicated. We live in a complex world. But I think what people often demand is not to be treated as ignorant. Experts are essential. Research is critical, but it is to have an informed public to be able to also make sure that politics and economics takes decisions that are rooted in who we want to be and the kind of societies we want to live in.
Oh, that's very inspiring.
Very inspiring.
Achim. The opportunity, I think, to collaborate, and one of the things that we want to talk about today is global collaboration, international collaboration, and certainly the research environment is one environment that helps create those international linkages. But it's not enough for just researchers to talk amongst themselves. It's certainly important, I think, for governments and countries now to really take a global view of tackling this problem and emerging from it better, as you've highlighted. And we've also very much noticed the importance of bringing more equal voice in these debates, whether it's from communities, different groups within communities, women and men, and the more marginalized voices, as well as making sure that in these global debates, countries in developing regions have that voice at the table, that have that opportunity to present their case. And it's central to our DNA at IDRC, I would say, this idea of partnership, of collaboration. But we both work extensively, IDRC and UNDP, in settings where institutional capacities and resources can be quite limited to support that kind of collaboration. And yet that collaboration is key to boosting those local capacities and achieving those development goals in these settings. UNDP has a global perspective here, Achim. What are you seeing right now? How do we boost and strengthen that international collaboration towards meeting the challenges facing us? What's genuinely representative? What does that real collaboration and global sort of equal voice look like to you?
I think it begins by recognizing that much of what defines our work today has to be focused on the future. You know, when I had the privilege of being appointed to lead the United Nations Development Program, I joined an institution that was born out of an age of development aid with a relatively simplistic but very practical and pragmatic view. We provide funding, we provide technology, we provide our experts and solutions, we help countries to essentially develop, and then they graduate. And we still have this strangely artificial graduation matrices, that metrics we use, such as GDP per capita. I think in leading a development program of the United Nations in the year 2020, I'm very much focused on trying to understand what does the future of development look like in terms of what countries, communities across the globe, first of all, are confronting, and secondly, what choices do they need to exercise? Because that is what defines, in a moment in time, development pathways. And I think development cooperation is something entirely different today than it was 30, 40 years ago. And it will again be something significantly different 10 years down the line. We live in a world today where some solutions do not emanate only from countries because they are industrialized and they are rich. Some of the digital frontiers, for instance, in applying that technology today for development, for poverty eradication, for gender empowerment, are most boldly being applied in some of the poorest countries because the need and the relevance there is so existential. And I think that is the departure point with which we need to look at what lies ahead. Now, there is another interesting issue here. We view development as a kind of economic graduation path. Yet, one thing that I constantly and continuously confront is the reality that most of the world's poor people, extremely poor people, don't actually live in the poorest countries by so-called rankings that we have in GDP per capita. They actually live in middle-income countries. So development cooperation, is it just a matter of residual issues that need to be addressed and then the world kind of turns inwards? No, we live in a globalized world. We need to shape that world, and our ability to be able to shape it is in part on being able to learn from one another, to be able to cooperate, and to also be able to invest in one another. And, you know, we spoke briefly at the beginning about the challenge of financing the response to the COVID-19 crisis. Anyone who does not look at our ability to invest in one another rather than just to provide some philanthropic support right now misinterprets the interdependence in which development is unfolding. The pandemic is just the most dramatic illustration. Climate change is another. Extremism, cybercrime. We all know the topics that define a development cooperation agenda of the future that is built, first of all, on a even more realistic understanding of interdependence and mutuality. And secondly, requires synchronized action. It requires collaboration. And that is why I think we will actually see in the coming years, I think, a far greater realization that when we talk about development cooperation, it is something that allows us to come together, to solve problems, to draw on each other's strength, and not that very traditional view that there is one part of the world that has cracked the development conundrum, and let's now help the other ones to do it as well. And this all happens in the midst of a world that is not only economically far more linked up through trade, but actually in our information society, in the digital networks, in the social networks, in the way citizens are able to not only interact with one another, but also trace the origins of a product in terms of whether that product is contributing to a climate or inequality problem or is actually helping to solve it, creates entirely different outlooks on how development will unfold. And I think these are just a few considerations in the current outlook on, you know, is the United Nations, is the UN Development Program something that really belongs to the past? Is an IDRC still needed? Is a World Bank essentially going out of business? I think if we were to continue doing what we were doing for the last 20 to 30 years, yes, it is a business model that is essentially going out of business. If we are genuinely cognizant of the development challenges, the need for international collaboration, the value of being able to act in unison, then I think we are actually facing an extremely interesting, very exciting prospect for understanding development in the way that the 2030 Agenda and the Sustainable Development Goals defined it. This is an agenda for every country because the actions of one will in part determine the future of the other, rich or poor.
Great, very inspiring, Achim. And I think the idea here that it's not just about governments or development agencies or intergovernmental organizations and multilateral organizations like the UN creating that global collaboration that you're talking about, and that partnership or sets of partnerships. And although I'm going to break just a little bit with the flow here, because we have a question from a member of the audience, the online audience here, that just fits so nicely with what you've just said, and the need for partnership. And the question is from our former Canadian ambassador to the United Nations, Marc-André Blanchard, and he asks, what do you think the role of the private sector is in development and in this global collaboration? Please share maybe some examples of collaboration that you've seen between UNDP and the private sector, and how this can help inform this vision you've just outlined of more partnership in the future.
Well, just taking some of the basic facts into account, the simplest way to answer this question is it's critical, it's central, and the private sector itself has to evolve its understanding of its role, just like governments need to evolve their understanding of how best to leverage the private sector. But let me begin by also reminding ourselves that, we often talk about the private sector as if they're only multinationals, the corporate end of the equation of the private sector. The reality actually is, even in the most highly developed economies, such as Japan, for instance, well over 95% of businesses are small, medium-scale enterprises. The same applies to Germany. I don't know the figures in Canada, but I would be surprised if they are significantly different. And so not only is the world of business actually a world that touches on virtually every one of us every day, whether we are consumers, service providers, owners of businesses, be it a corner shop, a workshop, or a startup. This is the world that employs us, that provides us with goods and services, that collectively determines the footprint, ecological or otherwise. And so I think to think about development in this day and age without according to the private sector the centrality that it de facto already occupies in our daily lives, but often out of a tradition that, I think hurt us a great deal. We spent much of the 60s and 70s and 80s even attributing to the state and government the singular role of shaping the kinds of societies, economies, and development choices we would make. Then followed the pendulum to the other extreme. The more market, the less government, the better. Just look at this crisis right now. We all have turned to government and the state. It was the one touchstone, whether I'm a citizen who is vulnerable, whether I'm somebody who is sick and needs to go to a hospital, whether I'm a business that needs a stimulus package because otherwise I'm going to go bankrupt. And, we can see that on our streets every day, what this is doing to our economy. The state remains a unifying element in our societies, but it does not negate the centrality of the private sector. And I will just touch on two examples that to me at the moment are very critical and highly relevant. One is the financial sector. We have just seen the Dow Jones Index last week cross the 30,000 points threshold. It's a record. In the midst of the worst pandemic that we could imagine, in the midst of an economic freefall, in the midst of a world where the Human Development Index for the first time in 30 years is going to decline this year. And it basically points to both a phenomena and a potential. The misalignment between where financial markets and the financial economy and the institutions that dominate it currently transact is simply too far from the reality where people are experiencing life and where the centrality of that $300 trillion wealth, because we are the richest generation in human history and we have more money than ever before. And yet that money is not deployable in the way that our economies are not able to align financial markets, who are private sector investors who want to have a return. But we need to find ways in which we incentivize economies where that capital can be invested to address inequality, eradication of poverty, cleaner energy, modern and clean transport systems, the kind of urbanization that doesn't end up with us living in cities where on one side of the river or a park, people pay 20 times more for their accommodation, and on the other side, people can't even afford to get their food in this crisis right now. And I think to all those who work in the financial world, be it banks, be it the hedge funds, in the stock markets. I think this is a moment of introspection because we need that world to invest in the kind of world that we need to get back to or get out of in the way that we recover. So that dialogue, most clearly and perhaps most actively conducted with the financial sector and the insurance sector on the issue of climate change, I think is central to the green recovery. And we are seeing significant movements now. The other sector is the technology sector. Digital technology, but also the world of bitcoins and others who will become fintech players. We have extraordinary possibilities. I had the privilege, together with Maria Ramos from South Africa, the former CEO of Absa Bank, to lead a task force for the Secretary General to prepare a report on digital finance and the SDGs, fintech and the SDGs. It's called People's Money, and I would commend it to you because it taught me an extraordinary amount. That world of technology that we often romanticize as startups, but that in the real world right now is leading us often to one or two companies becoming dominant players on a global level, needs to be developed in more of a sense of an ecosystem. I absolutely admire the ingenuity of those who have built businesses by leveraging technology, software, programming skills, and providing services that literally hundreds of millions of people want. But we need to recognize that that digital economy needs to be one in which we also have a society. It is one of the strange things that much of what we developed in a world that we call analog until a few years ago, including fundamental rights, protection of data and privacy, somehow ceases to be relevant in the digital world. And that cannot be right. So the regulatory framework enabling but also protective of citizens' rights, and then the policy incentives that would make an investment in that economy that we associate with the green recovery ideas more interesting is essential. We still spend $300 billion on subsidizing fossil fuels right now. The IMF estimates the cost of that distortion of our economy at $5 trillion every year. This is insane economics. And it is why financial markets will essentially be punished if they were actually to invest in the future, because the present is doing so well. Thank you very much. These are just a couple of examples of when we talk about the private sector, let's recognize its diversity, let's recognize its centrality, but let's also recognize that markets are not some God-given set of rules or laws of gravity as an equivalent. They are shaped by us as citizens, by the kinds of societies we want. And I think many business leaders today are actually beginning to join the forefront of those who are calling for a transformational approach to thinking about tomorrow. And that is vital because therein lies the financial muscle, the entrepreneurial ingenuity, and a view of business as being both something that benefits those who own it, but that ultimately can only thrive in a society that believes in it and allows it to operate.
Thanks, Achim. And I'm jumping in because we're close to the end of our time, so I'm going to ask you to do the impossible here. Very clear, and I'm struck by the comment you made about the Human Development Index backsliding. We have seen this on a number of indicators of the SDGs as well. We need to do things differently. This is a moment for acceleration and to addressing those root causes of our collective vulnerability. But I'm going to add also a question that came from Professor Armand Mestral from the Center for International Governance Innovation, and he's also with McGill, on how you see the impact of COVID-19, the pandemic, on international development and the way forward for the SDGs.
Well, knowing that you are at McGill, you probably have a clearer sense of that already than perhaps some of us do who are in the midst of managing the crisis. But let me offer perhaps a couple of reflections. I think the first thing that troubles me is development cooperation and the ability to be a partner to developing countries requires those with the means to finance that and to invest in that capacity to not walk away from it. we are seeing very different signals right now. There are some countries, Japan and Germany this year, who through their supplementary budgets have actually increased the financing to not just UNDP, but to developing countries and to supporting them. And there are others who have cut it. And the year 2021 will be even more serious. So first of all, let us recognize that, for many countries, if you just break it down in terms of per capita, what does it cost per citizen to sustain, for example, a United Nations system? It's sometimes a cup of coffee is the annual equivalent of what a citizen is essentially investing in this. There are some countries, smaller countries, who actually provide disproportionately higher contributions, and that is a generosity that they bring to this. I think we do need to recognize that we are going to face a significant financial shortfall, first of all, in the midst of the humanitarian appeals on the one hand, the extraordinary need to make sure that a vaccine becomes available to all and not to some. And this is the extraordinary task that the WHO, together with many countries, the COVAX platform has taken on. And then there is the development conundrum. Countries that have run out of money, that will go bankrupt, that will go into default. The G20 was fast, but it was not doing enough. It has agreed on a debt service suspension initiative. It extended it just now at its recent meeting. It adopted a common framework for managing debt. But let us be honest, we all know that this is insufficient, inadequate, and becoming more risky by the day in not being able to mount a response that is sufficient and equivalent to the challenge that we have. And that is a call that the Secretary General has made repeatedly, in Canada, together with Jamaica, was part of that Financing for Development Summit that has tried to bring that perspective more to the public. I think the second aspect in terms of development, and I'll leave it at that, is that I think what we need to invest in is critical. And we cannot do everything at once. We have to prioritize. UNDP's conclusion from the COVID-19 socioeconomic assessments and the recovery plans, the integrated national financing frameworks, these are all tools that we are deploying right now to help countries prioritize, to make choices, led us to prioritize, as I mentioned before, 4 areas: governance, the ability of governments to continue to function, but also the rule of law, ensuring that human rights and citizens' rights are not simply abandoned in managing a crisis, is critical to maintaining social cohesion. Secondly, social protection. We have to deal with these issues. That's why UNDP a few months ago issued a very quick paper in which we put forward the notion of a temporary basic income. We cannot beat the virus by starving people essentially to death. And that is why we need to look at intermediate steps. And these are critical tools that need to be deployed right now. We need to also understand the impact on women. Gender is a critical lens through which to look at COVID-19 and how to help women and girls at this moment. Gender-based violence is estimated to have increased by 30%. Many of the girls who are now out of school may never go back to school. And so social protection is a complex issue, but it is an emergency and it is fundamental to how we think about development, thinking and action coming out. Fourth, the green recovery, and and fourth, digital disruption. And the latter two, I just want to emphasize, we need to also persuade our citizens in those countries who finance development, be it through just a taxpayer in Botswana or a taxpayer in Britain, that we're not just investing in crisis, we have generational opportunities. Imagine connecting all schools on the planet to the digital and fiber optic cables. India has actually just initiated a program to connect 450,000 villages in the next 1,000 days. That's how you start tackling the extraordinary inequality that is driving education into a crisis right now, with over 1 billion children not being able to attend school. The kind of investment in connecting people to green electricity, decentralized solar networks that allow people for the first time to use electricity to water their fields, to have lights in their houses so kids can actually study, to deal with cleaner cooking, which is poisoning so many lungs. There are numbers in development that are totally unnecessary in today's world. 7 million people die prematurely every year, according to the WHO, because of indoor and outdoor pollution. 7 million people every year. This is not the price for development. This is the price for neglecting opportunities to act. And that, I think, is where people in the streets can buy into. Nobody wants to say, I'm not interested in whether 100 million people could have access to electricity or kids can go to school on another part of the world. Let's motivate, let's inspire our own citizens so that they believe also in the value of cooperation and of development support, because without that, we will truly face a real crisis in the next 6 to 12 months.
Well, thank you, Achim. Merci, Achim Steiner. Vraiment un réel plaisir d'avoir cet entretien avec vous. Beaucoup de questions extrêmement importantes pour nous. Je suis ravie aussi que vous aviez parlé du leadership et de l'innovation des pays du Sud pour faire face et offrir des exemples et inspirer non seulement leurs pays voisins, mais tous les pays du monde à trouver des moyens de travailler ensemble pour lutter contre les défis auxquels on fait face. I appreciate very much this opportunity to have this conversation with you. IDRC continues to look forward to collaborating with UNDP, with other organizations in that spirit of global collaboration, in the spirit of bringing evidence-based evidence of what works, supporting innovators to help find solutions to the things we don't have solutions for. And this pandemic has shown us how many things we don't have solutions for yet, and yet such a potential for finding them as we move forward to respond to this context. De la part du CORIM, de la part du CRDI, de la part de le PNUD, le Programme des Nations Unies pour le développement, je vous remercie, notre grand public virtuel, d'avoir participé. I thank all of our virtual audience for joining us today from CORIM, from UNDP, from IDRC. Thank you very much. Thank you, Achim Steiner.
Merci Dominique et merci à tous, et abandonnez pas votre confiance pour le futur, la sens de solidarité et le support pour l'idée des Nations Unies. C'est pas une idée de l'histoire seulement, c'est aussi une idée pour le futur, et nous sommes tous ensemble dans cette ambition. Merci beaucoup.